he said, "What is your nationality?" And I said, "I'm an Indian, sir." "Why do you have this hat on?" One fellow proposed that Mr. Jinnah should be called Quaid-e-Azam. And the only person who opposed it was Raja Sahib Mahmoodabad.
Assalamu alaikum ji. My name is Osama Siddiq. I am a legal academic, a policy reform person and a writer. And I've been associated with LUMS in various capacities. I've had the privilege of knowing Syed Babar Ali since 1991. I was a student in the MBA program, and then subsequently I also had the opportunity to teach at LUMS for many years. I shall be focusing today on Babar Sahab's tremendous career as an institution builder, but also hopefully looking at some of the other interesting aspects of his fascinating autobiography. Assalamu alaikum, Babar Sahab. So kind of you to take out the time, and there is so much to talk about, but I thought I'd focus on what is to me one of your most inspiring facets of your personality, which is you as an institution builder. But before I say anything else, I would like to ask you, and I say this because whenever we write a book, we sort of open ourselves to the world. It may be fiction, non-fiction, but that's particularly true for an autobiography. So I was intrigued that what inspired you to write this book.
Well, I had no intention of writing, except that over the years I was talking to various people that came to see me, or I interacted with them and narrated to them, you know, various experiences I'd had over the years and different walks of life. And then they said, "Why don't you write it down?" And so that made me think about it, but primarily as a record for the family rather than anything else. Or also, if I could contribute to inspire the youth to learn as to how what I did and how I did it, it could be an example for them to follow where needed.
Sure. No, it is an invaluable document at so many levels, and not just as a family chronicle. It's also a historical document because you've seen so many facets of history. And so I guess starting with the autobiography, one of the first things which struck me was the tremendous influence that your father, Syed Babar Ali, seems to have had on your personality. And I can see distinctly that he was a very cosmopolitan man. He was a man of great enterprise and innovation. And he's also someone who invested deeply in long-term relationships. And those are facets one can see in your personality as well. But my question is that it isn't often that a father necessarily has that indelible sort of impact on a child. So what was it in your case? What would you describe as the reason as to why you took so much from your father, or to what extent did he influence your personality growing up?
You know, he himself was a self-made man and self-educated man. And he learnt to improve his ability to communicate, his ability to improve himself in society, was to mingle with people who knew more than him, to rub shoulders with people. I don't know how he did it, but he managed to become friendly with many people who were much better off than him, both in terms of education, in terms of economic development. And this is something that he, you know, kept on doing for the rest of, during his whole life. And that is something that I think he wanted us to benefit from. Though we were lucky to go to a good school, to a good college, but he thought that the better education for us was to meet people, whoever came to see him. They were elders. I was maybe 10 years old, and whenever I was free, not at school, I was at home, it was mandatory for me to go and sit with whoever the guest was, and not to talk, but just to sit in a corner. And if anybody was invited for a meal to the house, it was mandatory for me to sit at the meal. So this way, and later on in life, when he was traveling, and many times when we had vacation, he would take me along, and whenever he went to an office, he took me along, and he not imposed me on his friends, but he always used to telephone them that my son is here, can I bring him along? And that again was a lot of learning for me, to meet people who were senior in whatever they did. They were important, they were politicians, they were primarily government functionaries in all walks of life, for instance in finance, because he was he was a member of the Board of Governors of the Reserve Bank of India. So he went to the Ministry of Finance in Delhi, he took me along. If he went to see the Governor of Reserve Bank in Bombay,
Sure.
he took me along.
Sure.
So that was a part of the way he thought that I would learn something more than at school and more than from friends. And that kept on going, and it did the same with my brothers. My eldest brother, Syed Babar Ali, he, after his education at government college, he went to England to study law at the Inner Temple. And this was the time when the Round Table Conference had started. So he then got in touch with some of the people he knew who had gone to the Round Table Conference as members of the Muslim delegation, and he said, my son is there, can he be of any service to you? And this is how my eldest brother got sort of sucked into politics. So this is, I can't thank him enough for the way he was grooming us.
This is remarkably progressive for the times, because this is an age where the adage children should be seen and not heard
Correct.
was quite common. So he was obviously ahead of his times. But having said that, despite the fact that he was obviously, a man of great progressive views, it's not necessary that the child then goes on to learn the same attributes. Parents can try. But you went a step further, and I say that in terms of your remarkable capacity to build and sustain institutions. So what do you think happened which also set you on this course of institution building?
Well, there, I was lucky that I had the opportunity to meet people who themselves are institution builders.
Sure.
For instance, our joint venture there, where I was totally involved with packages with the Rousing family. Mr. Rousing himself was an institution, because unfortunately there is no biography of his in English. There's one in Swedish. He, was unique even in the Swedish environment, which was very progressive, very not well, a great egalitarian, but very successful financially. Sweden was one of the richest countries after the two wars, because it had not taken part in the two wars, and it totally benefited by selling both to the British and to the Germans.
Yes.
And here, Rousing, I met him at a very early age. I was 28 years old, and he was perhaps 40 years older than me. And he took a liking to me. I was his partner here in Pakistan. I was running the company the way he wanted me to run it. Totally followed his directions, his instructions, his advice. So, and he, I spent a lot of time with him when he came here or when I visited him in Sweden. And so it was not just talking about business, it was talking about everything that came to his mind. And he kept nothing away from me. And so that was another exposure. So that was, I think, a very important and then of course the friends I made and came into contact as a result of my setting up of packages. My customers, these were large companies like Pakistan Tobacco Company, which was part of the BAT, British American Tobacco Company, Unilever, and others. And I not only met their local in charges, I met their people, who were bosses of their company at their head office. And that again was a very learning kind of an experience, how to meet people who are running a large industrial empire, and you talk to them, I was not shy of asking questions. So that was part of learning. And then of course, at a very early stage, when packages had come into being, we negotiated a loan with the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank. And there I went to Washington and had the opportunity to meet people at a senior level in the World Bank and the IFC. And all these things contributed to one's enhancing one's knowledge and kind of knowing as to how to go about it. And I was not shy to ask them what should we do, how we can improve, how we can develop. And my, throughout my career or my journey was not to build myself, but how to, because I was identifying whatever I did with the soil of the country, with Pakistan. I would not think of anything which was detrimental to Pakistan, but made us benefit from it. So that was a very rewarding experience. And meanwhile, the senior bureaucrats that one came across at the federal government primarily, and of course later on in the provincial government, I'm talking of 40 years ago, you had giants, among the civil servants who were willing to share their thoughts with you, willing to share their frustrations with you, and willing to encourage you to do things which they didn't expect others to do. So it was I was very lucky to have had this opportunity to interact with all these people who were true, I think, servants of Pakistan.
No, it is very evident that you came across opportunities, but you also created a lot of opportunities. And that, I guess, stemmed from the fact that you were very actively pursuing this thought to learn and to propagate those ideas. And what becomes very evident, as you mentioned, people who influenced you or who inspired you, is how their largesse or their openness to share has these long-term positive ramifications. Through them, the ideas come to you, through you to others. And this is a continuum, what we call sadka-e-jariya in our culture, but that's very obvious. Coming back to the autobiography, another thing which comes across, which I found very resonant, is your resilient positivity. You don't hold grudges. You are not embittered. You mentioned certain episodes, their ups and downs in life. I was particularly intrigued by this one episode where you were in the mountains and you came across this colonial officer, and you were on a horse and he wasn't, and there was his resentment, right? So must have been a very difficult time. I mean, you say it in a very subtle fashion, but one can gauge the environment under colonialism, what it must have been. There have been governmental persecutions, but I think how do you manage to keep positive? It's not very easy, and very few people manage to do that.
I don't know, I probably had a thick skin. But, that incident happened to my father, not me, on that horse.
That's right.
But I'll tell you another incident that happened to me at Aitchison College. Aitchison College, was a very colonial, set up by the British to raise young men who would always be loyal and faithful to them. And my father, on one of his visits abroad, he brought a felt hat for me.
Yes, I remember that.
And I was wearing, just to show off, I put on that hat to go out fielding. When I was playing cricket at St. College, I put on this felt hat. And Mr. Barry, who was, very much of a Tory, he said, "What is your nationality?" And I said, "I'm an Indian, sir." "Why do you have this hat on?" I mean, he even objected to me wearing a felt hat. So, but you didn't hold that as a grudge. Probably that was the way he looked at things. But he had other very positive aspects. He was very good in the classroom. I was one of his favorite students. So there was, and the teachers never carried their their impression of a student beyond that moment that you did not come up to their expectation, but they wanted to develop you, to bring you up, so that you could be a better gentleman, you could be a better person.
Well, that also underlines the fact that it is so very important to look at people multifariously, not to just take one trait and demonize them or valorize them. One other thing which comes across also is that you've always managed to strike a balance between modernity and tradition. So there are facets of your life which come across very clearly where tradition matters a lot to you. And yet in a lot of the things that you've done, you've had a very modern, progressive outlook, which sort of then begs the question that how do you define tradition and modernity, or what value do you ascribe to the tradition and what value do you ascribe to modernity, and why is it important to strike a balance, if anything?
Well, I think you can't be carried away to extremes. I mean, um, I think this again was the way we as a family, my father particularly, I mean, he said his prayers, but he didn't mind going to the church, for a service if there was a friend who died. And he didn't hesitate to go to a Hindu religious function if any of either it was a wedding or it was a death. So we tried to to us religion was a very personal thing. It was not something that we wanted to impose on others. I mean, just to mention that I joined Asian College at the age of 8. And I learnt namaz for the first time at Asian College because we used to have classes, religious classes, once or twice a week. And the Maulvi at Asian College, I don't know whether he was there during your time, but Maulvi Mahmud Hassan was his name. He taught us namaz the Sunni way. And my parents were Shia. So I said my namaz the Sunni way almost all my life till a year ago when I went to for ziyarat, and then I switched over to Shia namaz. For 80 years I said mine, and my parents never said anything, is tarah namaz padho, ya us tarah padho. So long as you are praying, that's good enough. So there was no hang up on what your personal beliefs were, so long as you're not flouting it. For instance, none of our people in the family consumed any alcohol, but my brother smoked, I smoked, but there was no way that we could smoke in front of our elders.
And you were very fond of dancing as well.
Yes, I did, and my brothers knew about it, but my father, he knew about it, but he never checked it.
Now these are, they seem refreshing words now in a day and age where the conflation of personal and public and private and religious and secular and governmental and, individual is becoming so blurred, and that sort of squeezed the space so much. The other thing is that unlike a lot of, and I try and avoid them, but unlike a lot of autobiographies written by generals and judges, you don't come across as a perfect man. You have shortcomings,
Sure.
You have weaknesses, you admit them openly, you have absolutely no qualms about doing that. What do you think have been shortcomings which you would have worked on if you look at things in hindsight, or what were things which you regard as setbacks and you would do things differently if you had the chance now?
I don't think I would have done anything differently.
You've always followed your conscience.
Yes, and also I never look back. I mean, if there was something that I did wrong, I tried to amend it by apologizing, but I didn't carry it home. So get on with life. I've had differences with individuals who did not conduct themselves properly, but I totally ignored them, and years later they came over it, and I never sort of mentioned to them that they had mistreated me or otherwise. I mean, you just forget about it.
So forgiveness has to play a big role in life.
Yeah, well, it's yes, or forgiveness, or you just have a bad memory.
So your formative years were very interesting to read about. I really enjoyed reading that, and it sort of very much made one understand how those years defined you. You also talk at length about the people who influenced you and the inspirations and various people you met in life. But it still strikes me that you put two different individuals in the same enabling environment, in the same childhood. They may still turn out to be different. So if we ascribe any value to rational choice and not just destiny. Do you think there are certain key decisions that you took in your life which determined your trajectory? And if you had not taken your decisions, you would have been a different person. Still a good person, still a beneficial person, but a very different person. Any sort of paths you took or any sort of crossroads you came to?
Well, one, I think, underlying factor which I did not want to go against was my wishes of my parents, both in terms of personal life and in terms of my career. At one time, I wanted to join the World Bank because I had an invitation from them, and my brother said, "We need you here," and there was no question of my saying otherwise. So I thought, in the larger interest of the family, I would not do anything which would in any way be a source of not regret, but a source of pain to them.
I mean, that comes through because it's very obvious that you made decisions to live in cities and take on work, which also had to do with being close to your family, taking care of your parents. So that played a huge role. What you owed to others or what you felt for others. But I guess in terms of deciding on a career in business, that could have been a predetermined trajectory. But then what you did thereafter, you found the leeway to do that. What role does adversity have in life? Because, the hard knocks of life. One realizes as one reads about the lives of people who have really tremendously contributed to society, almost everyone has had a bad time in life. It depends on how they deal with it and what they make out of it. So what's your philosophy towards adversity?
Well, luckily, I mean, God has been very kind. I mean, we had a major shock to our kind of business during Mr. Bhutto's time, but it we felt deprived, but it never sort of, in any case, we weren't despondent. We said, we will revive ourselves. We'll bounce back again, and which we did. And I've also mentioned it that he nationalized a number of our companies that we were managing and owning, but he then drafted me into public service.
That's right.
And I must say I enjoyed every minute of it because he and his senior colleagues in the government, both in the civil servants and the ministry, they knew that I didn't want the job. They wanted me.
Yes.
And I served them to the fullest ability that I had without any reservation. During that 4-year period, I repeatedly had offers from my minister, Rafi Raza, who was very close to Mr. Bhutto, as you know. Yes. He asked me to become his deputy minister, to run his ministry, and I said, I'll take all the decisions. What will you do? He said, well, then I don't want you. So I said, don't have me. Then he came to me, he said, I want you, why don't you become a senator? And I said, well, I belong to the opposite camp. I'm a capitalist at heart and you are socialist, so the two will not merge. But while I was there, I served the cause of the Bhutto government to the best of my ability. Nobody could raise a finger that I did anything which was in any way unethical or which in any way did not support the cause of the government. I mean, the whole idea was the corporation that I had should run well, should run, should be set up at the least, at the most economical cost, should be able to train people. And I can tell you that, I kept an eye on that corporation after I left. Even 10 years after I left, it was the best corporation running in the country because I managed to train the people and motivate them. Well, it was their own, I would give them credit for their own commitment to work. but they created that ambience and environment that, and they would be benefiting from that work. So I have no regrets from that point of view, and therefore, as I have said more than once, that I don't look back. If there is, if I stumble somewhere, see if you can walk properly afterwards.
Sure. So it shows also an ability to work with people who may be even diametrically opposed to you in terms of their ideology, or they may have done things which may have been hurtful. There's also this fascinating little story you tell about Mr. Bhutto coming to packages looking for rose bulbs,
Yes.
and he wanted a black rose,
Yes.
and you informed him there is now no such thing, but you'll get him the closest shade, and you apparently sent him some
Yes,
rose plants.
yes.
Now, I've increasingly sort of tried to learn from you and others that, one should not be judgmental about the next generation. I mean, I'm getting older, so I look at my students and all that. But one thing which strikes me, and it became even more sort of showcased and highlighted when I read the autobiography, is the significance of humility and gratitude. I mean, those two things you subconsciously and consciously emphasize again and again. And as I grow older, I myself realize how important that is. And, it pains one to say that. And I think everybody grows up and people learn from experience. But that seems to be an attribute which is becoming a bit rare now. You seldom see gratitude, and humility is also. So I would love for you to just expand a little bit on how you cultivated these attributes, or you acquired them, and why are they important?
Well, I mean, here again, I can give credit to my elders, because they never refused to meet anybody from any station of life. They never said, I don't have time for you. And I remember my father, who always had a good secretary, that he responded to every letter that he got, whether the reply was going to be positive or negative, but there was no such thing as ignoring a letter and putting it into the waste paper basket, or not, or even a telephone call that anybody made. This happened to my brothers. But later on, my elder brother, Syed Babar Ali, he, because he lived in Bombay and he got to know Quaid-e-Azam, he was then Mr. Jinnah, very well, because he had the liberty to go and see him. He was telling me once that he'd gone to see him, and Mr. Jinnah was sitting there with his secretary and a huge pile of letters. They were there, and he said, why don't you ask your secretary to send the reply on your behalf? He said, the letters are not addressed to my secretary, they're addressed to me.
Yes.
So, I mean, these are things that he told me at that time, and so therefore one learnt that, if somebody had written to you, he had taken some trouble or she had taken some trouble, you have to respond. And my father used to tell me time and again, he said, what his father told him, he said, beta usi darakh ko phal lagta hai jo jhukta hai. And you saw that in him. If anybody came to see him, he always saw him to the car. And these are small courtesies, but was a part of his life.
Talking about letters, I was thrilled to see that Mr. Jinnah, Mr. Gandhi and Mr. Nehru all wrote back to you.
Yes, yes.
And you were a young man.
Yeah.
But it's inconceivable to think of it this today, considering that people of that, there's nobody of that stature around anymore. But even if you were half that stature, you would think so much of yourself that you would never do that. But they all wrote back to you, and it's also fascinating how their personality reflects in their letters. So Mr. Nehru is incarcerated, Mr. Jinnah has a certain dignity to it, and Mr. Gandhi asked for a donation.
Yes.
So I can imagine how that must have impacted you as a young person.
Yeah. No, but I took it well, and I responded to all three. Yes. I went to, I wrote to this studio which he said I could get his photograph from. I got that photograph and I got him to sign it.
Yes.
Mr. Nehru, he said, remind me when I'm back, out of jail. He sent the picture to me, signed picture, which was his own. And to Mr. Gandhi, I sent him a picture and 5 rupees for the
Yes,
for the
right, that's right.
So, I mean, these people were men of word.
Yes. So, since we are talking about them, and since it's always very valuable to talk to you about the phenomenon of leadership, one thing which seems to be getting more and more scarce is this tolerance for dissent, for differing opinions. And you find in these people and most people of that generation, of that stature, that they had a big heart. And they had they would take a strong stand when it required to be that way. So when you became a leader of yourself, a leader, a captain of industry, when you were in leadership in various institutions you set up, how did you obviously also thought similarly, which became evident later, but how did you ensure that you promoted an atmosphere where there was tolerance for difference of opinion?
That this was a part of our makeup of our, taking decisions. If there was something important, I certainly gathered the senior people of the company that I was associated with and shared with them what the issues were and asked everybody for an opinion. I gave my opinion, and sometimes I took a decision and somebody came in and he said, that the decision should be something else, and I changed it. So there is no such thing as being sacrosanct that I've taken a decision and we have to go through with it.
If somebody produces better arguments, better evidence.
Convince me, and we are all working for the same cause.
And you never felt so aggrieved by somebody's dissent that you
No, never, no.
Now, related to this, I think you make a very interesting and a very sort of wise observation about the distinction between delegation and abdication. So you do decentralize. I mean, I've experienced it myself. You devolve things. How would you define the art of delegation?
Well, I mean, if somebody is willing to say that, all right, leave it to me, and I said, all right, here it is, but I keep myself informed as to what you're doing. Sure. Not spying on you, but coming to you and say, tell me how things are, and then discussing it and giving my opinion and learning from you as to what you or whoever is doing it. So, I mean, abdication doesn't mean that I go to sleep and wake up after 6 months when things have gone wrong if somebody has done it. But you keep yourself informed, and if you think that all is not well, you just point it out to him, and if he's not willing to change, if a change is required, you do that.
Okay. However, mercifully in our society, there's a lot of philanthropy. We are not tight-fisted people, generally speaking. If anything, contemporary research shows that per capita, there's a lot of philanthropy here. And you have done a lot of philanthropy itself, but you've also done a lot of institution building. We have a lot of philanthropy, but we have very little institution building, and we also have very little institution building around philanthropy. Why is that?
I mean, the way I have learnt, and this is, I think it goes back to Edson College. If I mean, every inch of Edson College is very sacred to me, and it has been because the years I spent there. And if you walk around, you see many buildings with plaques and with stones on them that this was built by so-and-so.
Yes.
And so one felt that if you want to do something, it should be done in a manner that it's inspiration for others to follow. And, I mean, you go to a shrine and you put money into the box. You do it because it has to be distributed to the poor, but it's gone. You have no idea as to how it's spent. But here, what I have learnt over the years is that whatever little I have given, I want to make sure that I can see it having an effect, not in the form of brick and mortar, but if it is a scholarship, I'd like to meet the student who is availing that scholarship to see how we can help him learn more, how we can help him develop. So, I've always sort of differentiated between, I've explained it to people, in the olden days I used to go hunting and you have a shotgun where you use a cartridge which has maybe 100 pellets in it, and you fire at a flock of birds hoping that one would drop.
Sure.
And the other one is you take a rifle and you have a bullet and you point it out at an animal and you say, to make sure that you get what you're wanting. So my sort of tendency of investing or giving is that I've taken the rifle rather than the gun, to make sure that whatever I invest in or whatever I contribute to, it has a
Specific impact.
it has a
yes.
specific objective,
Sure.
and it benefits somebody.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it. And it just occurs to me also that this city, your city, is actually a city which has seen a lot of institutionalized philanthropy in the past. There's the Gangaram hospitals and the Gulab Devi hospitals but then there was a bit of a break in that sense. So in that sense, it's very interesting how you approach this entire thing. I'm now going to move from the more sort of philosophical and abstract questions I had to your specific role in institution building and the various institutions you built. And my slight bias is, of course, towards educational institutions, because that's what I've experienced directly in terms of working with you. So my next question is that in institutional building, because we do know that institutions have various critical phases. There's the pre-establishment, the early years, consolidation, growth. But you as a pioneer, what are the specific responsibilities a pioneer has in order to ensure that there is sustainability? There are institutions which never survive.
Yeah, to me, the most important thing when you want to embark on a new journey or set up an institution is to find a person who would take it forward. For instance, if you look back to the history of LUMS, it was Javed Hamid. I knew Javed Hamid from his time when he was in the Planning Commission and used to come to the Fertilizer Corporation. I got to know him. I knew that he had been to the Harvard Business School. So the initial thought of starting LUMS was just to have a business school.
That's right.
So meanwhile, he had moved from the Planning Commission. He'd got a job at IFC in Washington with the World Bank. And so I used to go to Washington regularly. So I went and asked him, I said, I'm thinking of a business school, but I need somebody to set it up, and would you be interested? He jumped at it. He said yes, and I said, but he said, I won't leave the bank if you can get me leave of absence. So I knew people in the bank, and I went and managed to get him 4 years leave of absence. And I invited him to come to Packages as a part of Packages establishment. The World Bank was not paying. I was sort of taking care of him. And I said, now you are here, go about and see how we should go about it, because he knew more about the business school than I did. So I said, whatever you need from me, I'm here to help you. So he drew up a letter, for the charter, which was, there was martial law. It was addressed to General Ziaul Haq. Luckily, I had the opportunity to meet General Ziaul Haq a few times. So I sought a meeting with him. And I took this letter, and the letter said, we would like the government to give us a charter so that this university is independent. The second is, anybody who contributes any money to this, you can write it off as an expense against their income, because we had to raise money. And the third was that the President of Pakistan would be the Chancellor, because in order to get that protection that nobody would bother you.
Yes, this was an ordinance, I believe.
Yes, it was an ordinance, and then of course it went through an act.
Sure.
And he said, you want land? I said, no. You want money? I said, no. And within a few weeks, we got the charter.
Yes.
And it was Javed Hamid, the way he drafted it. And then, of course, we were very lucky that there was his Minister of Education was a very fine gentleman. He came from the Punjab University. He was in the public sector. So he had just given a charter to Aga Khan University. So they took that charter and took away the elements which pertain to the medical college, and we have an identical copy. So again, then Javed Hamid said, we need faculty. I said, how do you recruit faculty? He said, we should go to America. We should go and find out who the Pakistani people are in in the teaching profession, we went there. So it wasn't me, it was people who were guiding me, and I was willing to go along with that and put my weight and money behind them.
Sure.
And this is how you build institutions. And of course, in the initial stages of setting up the foundation and everything else, I called in Razak and then Parvez Hassan, and I said, this is not a one-man show, this has to be a team effort. And this is how I've worked. Everything that I've done in life is not to put myself in front, but to say, who else is going to help me do that?
So, finding the right partners, identifying the right expertise, listening to the right advice, and making it a collective endeavor. And that makes a lot of sense in the pioneering years. Now, as the institution grows and matures, do you think that a more preferred way is to identify successors or people who take it forward, or to build systems which will self-select people? Because there can be a difference of approaches on that as well. Which one do you find?
Well, I think both will work. Both will work. You cannot have this or that. You certainly bring in new blood, people who are say kind of signatories to your thought,
yes,
who believe in the same mission. And within the organization, if there are individuals who have the ability to grow and take on higher responsibility, I mean, one would follow both.
So when one looks at the great Western universities, let's say, and looks at, whatever is available of the lives of John Harvard or Elijah Yale or Ezra Cornell, you see in the early years a big imprint of personalities, obviously. That's always natural. You also, to a certain extent, see the role of the families, because oftentimes it's collective enterprise or collective assets and all that. And then ultimately you see things moving on to professional boards and things like that. Do you think it becomes an onus for the family to also, because they may or may not share the same idealism,
No, correct.
Does it become a burden for them? Should they be expected to be part of it, or do you think it's a beneficial thing?
Well, in order to avoid that situation where the future of LUMS is dependent on the family, I've created a trust, which where I have donated a part of my own wealth, and I'm going to ensure that the trust's first obligation is to keep LUMS wheels oiled, and I'm trying to interest my family members that here is something that you owe it to yourself and to the future generations, that try and do better than what I have done. And if you have other ideas, go and spend your own money, but not my money. My money has to go to LUMS.
Okay. So that's safeguarding
So,
that.
yeah,
Okay.
so I've done that.
Fair enough. Is there a difference, Babar Sahib, in how you approach setting up a not-for-profit institution as compared to a for-profit institution, or the fundamentals
No, I think
the same?
both should have total, accountability. Both should have competent people managing it on merit, and both should be accountable of what they produce. I mean, I'm after LUMS all the time. How our students are doing, how they are conducting themselves abroad, how they have done in the marketplace after they get their degree. And of course, in a profit, in an organization which produces goods, well, if you're not producing the right quality, nobody is going to buy it. So you've got to make sure that they are competent and competitive, both in quality and price. So there is no difference to me. Both have to be well managed. You can't have second-rate people managing a not-for-profit.
Of course. And I ask this for a particular purpose because at times there can be this tendency on part of some people to think that this is being done for charity, so I can be relaxed. But if you really want to do a good job of it, the parameters are the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
The standards are the same. Now, I've had the privilege of working with you and working under your leadership, and I distinctly remember that when some of us came up with the idea of the law program, how encouraging you were and how you steered us and yet gave us space. But you, Babar Sahib, are an exception. And my question is this, that one of the biggest challenges which institutions and organizations in Pakistan face is brain drain and attracting good people. And whereas the minority like you would always value them, give them respect, And I'm not talking about the financial, because these people also sacrifice a lot. They give up careers and come back. But that's not the norm. How does one ensure that? How does one ensure in the institutions you've created, but generally, that's a cultural issue, that people will respect a financial contribution a lot more than the contribution by somebody of, let's say, lifetime of service at a subsidized rate?
No, I think it's the attitude. You have to value people's effort. You have to honor them. You have to respect them. What you cannot, what compensation you can't give them financially, you can certainly make up for it by giving them the kind of respect and the kind of dignity that you can offer them. And that, I think, is very important.
That is incredibly important. It's of course best if it's done genuinely, but even if it's done symbolically, it's okay.
I believe whatever you say, you have to believe in it.
Of course, of course. And I guess a question related to this is about knowledge itself, about scholarship. So I mean, especially when people get associated with educational institutions or knowledge production, it becomes incredibly important to be able to understand what that is. Now, you know it a lot better than most of us do, the status of the professor in the Western civilization, right? And that used to be in the Eastern civilization as well. The ustad, the scholar, was a big thing. And so to get a tenured professorship at an Ivy League institution is a lot harder than becoming the managing director of a Wall Street company. There is a huge gap when it comes to that. The teacher is not respected in our society, the professor, the person who writes books. And so this is a more generic question. Of course, you've managed to create environments where this has changed, but what needs to be done at a societal, at a larger governmental level?
I think this thing has to be inculcated. The problem is that most of our people who are in a position of power today do not have that, have not had that benefit of learning, learning what learning is.
Yes, yes.
I give you a very interesting story which my mother related to me. Her elders were in the court of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. And one day, Fakir Azizuddin, who was one of his ministers, was with him. And Maharaja was in a bad mood, and he came in and he said, Fakir Sahab, the teachers, even of the princes, Ranjit Singh's sons, were Maulvis, because there weren't too many Sikhs who could teach Persian. Persian was a court language, even Ranjit Singh. And he said, you know what, today your mullah has insulted Khadak Singh, his heir apparent. And he was very sort of enraged. So Azizuddin turned around and he said, you should congratulate the mullah instead of feeling. So Ranjit Singh immediately changed his mood and he said, he said, please call the mullah. So as he entered the room, he said, Maulvi Saad, with which hand did you strike
Yes.
the prince?
Yes.
So the Maulvi thought that his hand would be cut off, so he said the left hand. He said, fill it up with bangles of gold.
Yeah.
So this is
That's
how
a very telling story.
even a illiterate ruler like Ranjit Singh
Valued.
was educated by his minister to value the importance of a teacher. Can you go and tell anybody in Islamabad today what a teacher should be like? I was shocked. I met the new Vice Chancellor of Government College University. He came to see me the other day. I said, he has spent 37 years abroad. First job that he has in Pakistan. I said, how is your relationship with Pakistan, with Islamabad? I was kept waiting for 3 hours by the Minister of Education and by the Higher Education Commission chairman, and they had no time for me.
My goodness. Yeah. This is one of the premier institutions.
The institute which has produced 3 Nobel laureates.
3 Nobel laureates, indeed. And one lived in the neighborhood. which is Kipling.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
So, I mean, if you have that kind of an attitude that a vice chancellor is kept waiting
yes.
while you are looking at meeting an MNA to transfer a clerk from station A to B, shows your sense of priority.
Absolutely. I think that sort of encapsulates the entire tragedy of it. One other question, which of course goes once again to the larger sort of collective challenge, is knowledge production. So Pakistan has some fairly good universities now. There are some excellent teachers. But we still have this huge challenge to climb up the rankings when it comes to either the region or internationally. And we do see also a domination by certain countries. So America has majorly invested in education. Harvard has an endowment of $35 billion, as you know. What we are still not seeing are publications, research, and both applied research, but as well as sort of more philosophical research, even though a more enabling environment has been provided. So this is a huge intellectual challenge. Since you have overseen the growth of educational institutions and contributed some of the best ones, what is stopping us?
Well, I mean, think the malady starts right at the bottom at the primary school and the middle school. There is no culture of reading here in this country. You know, I had over the years sponsored publication of a number of books on Sufi poets and other things. And even 1,000 copies, nobody was willing to buy it. You had to give them away. And if you have in a country of 200 million people where you can't sell 1,000 copies of a local indigenous poet like Bulleh Shah or Shah Hussain,
Farid, and yes.
So it's pathetic that there is no reading culture here at all. And this thing has to be inculcated from an early age. I can tell you, if you were to say that between all the members of the assemblies of the provinces and the cabinet, if you say if they have read one book a year put together, it would not make one book.
Yeah.
So there is a dearth of knowledge and reading and studies, with the result that there's no reading culture, and therefore there is no promotion of new knowledge. You know, if you look at new books being released all over the world, new ideas are coming up who are challenging yesterday's ideas, and there is no such discussion anywhere. So we need to, we are paying the price of 70 years of total neglect of education. We have not invested in education. They have always picked the weakest member of the cabinet to be education minister, or the weakest bureaucrat to be the minister, secretary education. And you saw in the paper today that in the last 6 months we've had 6 different changes of secretaries of higher education here in Punjab alone.
Mm-hmm.
And Punjab is 50% of the country. So if education, I mean, people think education is expensive. Ignorance is 10 times more expensive.
It is, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And if I may add, there was also, it occurs to me, even a few decades ago, a celebration of literature. So you would find poets and writers to be iconic cultural figures, right? So, and people keep saying that the giants have disappeared, but maybe it has to do something with the soil, that it has stopped producing them. I mean, on a more positive note, even though I completely agree with what you're saying, what I've discovered as someone who makes a living out of writing books is that perhaps part of the problem is affordability, and part of the problem is that the book publishers don't put enough effort to promote books. One good thing is that once you produce a book, it always has a resonance. I have all the Sufi books which were produced by packages, and I still benefit from them. And so in that sense, I think it carries on having an impact. But so final question about academics, scholars and faculty, and then I'll go to my last 3 questions. And the final question is that when do you see our system graduating to a level where scholars and teachers actually have a much larger role in the actual governance of the university? I actually did a study a few years ago for the World Bank on the governance framework of all the universities in Pakistan. There were major issues, even compared with the Model Universities Act. And one thing which comes across is that they're political appointees, that this and that, but the academics themselves, and they're mostly described as bad managers, not as if the others are good managers. Do you think that's an important thing, that the academics themselves eventually also have a stake in the governance of the place?
Well, they ultimately should, but again, they must realize that they can't do everything.
Of course.
And they need to bring on board people who would help them, for instance, manage the finances.
Yes, of course. They need
or the administration or the recruitment of staff, and those have to be done on merit, and it requires another skill rather than an academic. So, but it will only happen when the decision makers, the policy makers, the politicians realize that that education is more important than defense.
Absolutely. I want to slightly shift gears and talk about Mr. Jinnah. And the reason I want to do that is because I distinctly remember that when we were setting up the law program, you said, I want this law program to produce the future Jinnahs, Nehrus and Gandhis. Now, with the tolerance that we have, maybe we'll have to deduct the last two names here. But it occurs to me that Mr. Jinnah is a very curious man in various ways. I mean, he comes from a very institutionalized, he's very anglicized, he's a barrister, he's in a very structured profession. But he's also a rebel. He rebels against the status quo. He rebels against that very system which made him who he was. And so he had no bosses. Ultimately, he's also a fiercely independent man. And so I would love to hear from you both an assessment of Mr. Jinnah as a leader and as a person. And of course, you've had the privilege to have actually sort of met him, and any recollection which stayed with you.
Well, I tell you, I mean, you read, I think the best book that reflects his life is Walpert's.
Walpert's book is very good. Yes.
And he was very a loner. I
Yes.
mean, he was a very private, very lonely person. He said it on more than one occasion that I'm here to plead your cause to the Muslims. I'm not there to set an example by of being a big, by practicing Muslim. I'm here to advocate your cause so that you can have your rightful place in society. And he was totally, uncompromising on that. He was a very cold person, not warm at all, except with very few people.
Okay.
To him, the cause of the Muslims was sacred. He was not willing to compromise on things that he didn't believe in. And we were very lucky because, I grew up, I was 20 years old at the time of partition, and I started taking interest in politics from the age of 12. So those 8 years prior to partition, I could, through the family connection and otherwise, one got to know many of the leaders of the Muslims, particularly. And I can tell you, if it hadn't been Jinnah, there would have been no Pakistan.
Yes.
And people backed him for only one reason, that he was not for sale.
Yes, his integrity.
Yes. So he was a man of impeccable integrity. And there again, if you study the political history of India, he was at one time a nationalist. He was very keen that Congress and Muslim League should work together. But when Gandhi came in and introduced religion into politics, he said this will destroy the combination of the two. You can't bring religion into politics. And therefore he went away.
Yes.
And it was Iqbal who brought him back. He said, there is no other leader in India who can lead the Muslims. You come back and lead the Muslims, because we need somebody to lead them, and to provide an honest leadership. So I would say that we were very fortunate to have him. The person that he was very fond of, because Jinnah spent a lot of time in his home, was Raja Mahmudabad.
That's right. Okay.
You know, when he was the legal advisor to his father, Maharaja Mahmudabad. His father was Maharaja,
Okay.
and so Raja Sahab grew up, under Mr. Jinnah's shadow, and so he was very, very fond of him. And there is one particular story which I don't think has been written so far, that Raja Sahab had a friend of his age who was the son of his estate manager, Sheikh Habibullah, who retired who was a bureaucrat in the UP Assembly, UP government, retired, and he was managing the Mahmudabad estate. And his son, Ali Bahadur Habibullah, you used to call him Sunny Habibullah. Sunny was Raja Sahab's age.
Okay.
So Raja Sahab wanted to go to Bombay because he took a tremendous fancy to Devika Rani, the actress.
Okay.
And of course, going to Bombay, they had to stay with Mr. Jinnah. So both Sunny Habibullah and Raja Sahab, Sunny mentioned to me because Sunny was a very dear friend of mine. They were staying there, and in those days, people who know about the Indian film industry, most of the filming took place at night.
Okay.
I don't know why. So they went to see the filming of Devika Rani, and one evening they came back at 3 o'clock in the morning, and here was Mr. Jinnah pacing up and down in his dressing gown, worrying about them where these young men had disappeared.
Of course.
So I mean, that was the soft point of his life, but there again, I mean, Raja Sahab was a man of sterling qualities. He was a member of the working committee, and nobody else would narrate this to you, that, the khushamdis that we have in these cabinets and in these committees. One fellow proposed that Mr. Jinnah should be called Quaid-e-Azam. And the only person who opposed it was Raja Sahab Mahmudabad. He said, Quaid-e-Azam is not him. Quaid-e-Azam is somebody who is a religious leader, and Mr. Jinnah is not a religious leader.
And yet the name stuck.
Mr. Jinnah loved it. That was his weakness. But he didn't hold it against Raja Sahab.
No.
And Raja Sahab lost all his property because of this, and he was the one main financier of Muslim League before partition. All the income, or most of the income of Mahmudabad, went to Muslim League for its support. So he was a unique individual, and today his son and family are struggling in India for retaining their property.
That's right. I come to the final question. All your life, some of your main preoccupations have been industry, commerce, finance, institution building, governance, and yet literature and art seem to be very close to your heart. We already mentioned the wonderful publications of Sufi poetry which came out, and I really hope there are sort of reprints of that. There's the Naqsh School, and routinely you've been giving a lot of your own money to these kinds of causes. And why is it so? What's the role of art and literature and culture in life? Why do you think it's important?
I think these are integral part of what we are today. I mean, for instance, when my father passed away, I had to look after his trust, and I found out that there was a Haveli in the old city in Bazar Hakima, which he had bought from my mother's family and put it into his trust. Now, that had to be maintained. And there was some other property also which was very derelict, and I went to see it, and I said the only way to revive any property is to populate it, to have it, to put some people to work and live in it. And I didn't want to convert that into school because government would nationalize the school. Then I said, in Pakistan, we knew that calligraphy was disappearing. At HSN, you would remember that about 40 years ago, I instituted a prize for handwriting Urdu and English, because this is something that I was very keen, because my mother made me write on a takhti. So I said, all right, we will have we will have a building which we'll call a takia, where people who are elders and proficient in a particular skill would come and sit, and we would make that place available. So he said we would have a takia for calligraphists and a takia for miniature artists. That
yeah.
again was disappearing. And luckily we found two individuals
Yes.
who were, lived there worked for us for about 10 years, and they passed away. But they
Trained
created
a lot.
enough of legacy that the whole thing is carrying on. And then I got hold of one of my friends who had worked at Packages, Mr. Rumi, who was in charge of the art department. I said, now, he said, why don't you make a poor man's National College of Art and call it Naqsh? And that's how Naqsh came into being. And it's very heavily subsidized. But what has happened is that we have been able to create a new cadre of maybe a few hundred young men and women who had no prior education at all, but had the skill to learn to write, to write well in Urdu or to draw. And they are today earning a lot of money and calligraphy, and both these things are revived.
And they're producing beautiful work. I've come across it and bought some of it, and it's remarkable. Baba Sahib, it's been a privilege. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Osama, it's been a long time since we met, but I hope we'll have other occasions to meet.
I would love to. The only thing is one doesn't want to impinge on your time. Everybody wants to meet you.
You are
one
most
queues
welcome.
up.
No, you have a very special place.
That's very kind of you, and thank you for all the wonderful things you've contributed to everyone's life.
I hope this will be useful.
Baba Sahib, in 1969, it was the first time that environment was also discussed.
Yeah.
And you were very happy that it has been discussed at this level. That was a good starting point.
That was the first time.
Yeah.
And I still remember this lady who was the Minister of Environment from the Netherlands.
Okay.
She was sitting there and she said, this glass of water that is lying before me, we are told that this has been drunk 7 times before.